Right now, while you are sitting and watching this, your body contains microscopic clusters of cancer cells. Not maybe, not possibly, almost certainly. Every major cancer research institution, from Harvard to Johns Hopkins to the National Cancer Institute, agrees on this. The question was never whether those cells exist. The question is why, in some people, they stay frozen and harmless for decades, and in others, they ignite. I spent 2 years tracking that answer through the clinical literature. And what I found had nothing to do with genetics alone. It had everything to do with what you put on your plate. My name is Dr. Pablo. I am a board-certified geriatrician with 18 years of clinical experience working exclusively with adults over 60, and a significant portion of that work has been in cardiovascular and cancer-adjacent care, watching what happens to aging bodies when the balance tips the wrong way. And I want to be very direct with you today, because the research I am about to walk you through is not fringe science. It is not alternative medicine. It is published in peer-reviewed journals, replicated across multiple institutions, and it has been sitting in the medical literature for decades, while most clinicians never once mentioned it to their patients. Here is what you need to understand first, because everything else builds on this foundation. Your body is not passive when it comes to cancer. It is actively, constantly, aggressively fighting it. Right now, your immune system is running what amounts to a continuous patrol, scanning for abnormal cells, flagging them, and eliminating them before they can establish themselves. You have roughly 40 trillion cells in your body, and they divide constantly to replace old and damaged tissue. Every time a cell divides, there is an opportunity for a copying error. And some of those errors produce cells that are technically cancerous. This is not a disease process. This is normal human biology happening in every single person reading this right now. So why are we not all dying of cancer by 50? Because your body has defense systems that are, under the right conditions, extraordinarily effective. The problem is that after 60, those systems begin to operate differently. The immune surveillance that worked so reliably in your 30s and 40s starts to lose precision. DNA repair mechanisms slow down, and the internal environment of your body, shaped in large part by what you eat, either supports those defenses or quietly undermines them. Now, I want to tell you about a mechanism that most people have never heard of, and once you understand it, you will never think about cancer prevention the same way again. It is called angiogenesis. That word simply means the growth of new blood vessels. Your body regulates this process constantly and carefully because blood vessels are how every tissue in your body gets oxygen and nutrients. You need exactly the right amount of them, not too few, not too many. Here is what makes cancer so dangerous. A microscopic tumor, a tiny cluster of abnormal cells, cannot grow beyond about 1 to 2 millimeters in diameter without a blood supply. That is smaller than a grain of rice. It can sit in your body for years, even decades, completely frozen in place, unable to expand, unable to spread, because it simply cannot access the nutrients it needs to grow. Your body in this state is winning. But cancer cells are resourceful. They release proteins, particularly one called vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF, that essentially send a signal to your body's blood vessel construction system saying, "Grow toward me, feed me." And if that signal goes unanswered, the tumor stays frozen. If it goes answered, what happens next is almost incomprehensible in its speed. Researchers at Harvard Medical School tracked tumor growth rates using advanced imaging and found that once blood vessels penetrate a tumor, the growth rate increases by a factor of 16,000 in approximately 14 days. A cluster the size of a pinpoint becomes the size of a grape in 2 weeks. 16,000 times in 2 weeks. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because it is the reason I am so urgent about what I am going to tell you next. Pharmaceutical companies have spent billions of dollars developing drugs that block tumor angiogenesis, drugs that cut off the blood supply to tumors and starve them into dormancy or death. These drugs exist. They are used in cancer treatment today. They work. But they come with significant side effects because they affect blood vessel growth throughout the entire body, not just inside tumors. What the research discovered next is what changed my clinical perspective entirely. When scientists at leading institutions began testing the same angiogenesis blocking assays they used for pharmaceutical compounds, but applied them to extracts from common foods, the results stopped them cold. One food in particular produced results so striking that the researchers stated publicly. If they had not known it came from a plant, if they had believed it came from a pharmaceutical lab, they would have moved it directly into clinical trials. I will get to that food in a moment. But the broader discovery was this. Over 100 different foods have measurable anti-angiogenic properties. 100. They can slow or stop the growth of blood vessels that feed tumors. This is not measured by how someone feels. It is measured in laboratory assays where you can directly observe blood vessel growth being inhibited by compounds extracted from food. And that is only the first mechanism. The second mechanism is DNA repair. Every single day, your DNA absorbs damage from ultraviolet radiation, from environmental pollutants, from the byproducts of normal metabolism inside your own cells. Your body has repair systems for this, molecular maintenance crews that identify breaks and fix them before they become permanent mutations. But those systems are not self-sustaining. They require specific nutrients to function. Without adequate nutritional support, DNA damage accumulates silently. No symptoms, no warning, just a slow erosion of the cellular architecture that keeps abnormal growth in check. I have a patient. I will call her Dorothy. She is 73 years old, a retired pediatric nurse from Ohio, sharp as anyone I have ever met, meticulous about her medications, her blood pressure readings, her annual appointments. Dorothy came to me 3 years ago after a cancer scare, a suspicious finding on a routine scan that ultimately turned out to be benign, but it shook her. She sat in my office and said, "Dr. Pablo, I did everything right. I do not understand what happened." And what I told Dorothy that day is what I want to tell you now. Doing everything right, in the traditional sense, not smoking, limiting alcohol, maintaining a healthy weight, is essential. But it is only half of the equation. The other half is actively supplying your body with the specific compounds it needs to run its anti-cancer defense systems at full capacity. Avoiding harm is not the same as building protection. Dorothy understood that immediately, and the changes she made in the following 6 months were straightforward to implement and grounded entirely in published research. That is exactly what we are going to cover today. 6 specific foods, the precise mechanisms through which they work, the research that supports each one, and exactly how much of each you need to be eating. And I want to be clear about something before we begin. I am going to tell you about the single most powerful food on this list, the one with the most dramatic evidence behind it. But I am saving it for last, because I want you to understand the full picture before we get there. Every item on this list works through a different pathway, and together they create a layered defense that no single food can provide alone. Let us begin. The first food is one that almost nobody associates with cancer prevention. It is small, inexpensive, available in every grocery store in America, and the research behind it is some of the most compelling nutritional science I have encountered in 18 years of practice. We are talking about kiwi fruit. Scientists at the University of Oslo in Norway recruited 43 healthy adults and divided them into groups eating 1, 2, or 3 kiwis per day for 3 weeks. At the end of the study, they measured DNA damage in the participants' cells using a technique called the COMET assay, a test that literally shows broken DNA strands under a microscope. The broken strands look like comets with tails trailing behind them, which is where the name comes from. The participants eating 1 kiwi daily showed 60% less DNA damage compared to their own baseline measurements at the start of the study. 60% from a single piece of fruit. But the participants eating 3 kiwis daily showed something that goes beyond prevention. Not only was new DNA damage blocked, but existing damage was actively repaired. Their cells showed a 60% improvement in DNA repair capacity, meaning the molecular machinery that fixes broken genetic code was operating significantly more effectively than it had been 3 weeks earlier. The mechanism involves vitamin C. Kiwis are extraordinarily concentrated in it, but it goes beyond that. Kiwis contain polyphenols, flavonoids, and carotenoids that work in concert with the vitamin C in ways that isolated supplements simply cannot replicate. This is a critical point I want you to understand. A vitamin C capsule will give you antioxidant activity. A kiwi will give you vitamin C plus dozens of synergistic compounds that enhance each other's effects at the cellular level. The whole food is categorically more powerful than the isolated nutrient. 1 to 3 kiwis daily, that is the target. The second food has been studied longer and more extensively than almost anything else in nutritional oncology: green tea. And I want to be precise here. because there is an enormous difference between what I am recommending and what most people consume when they think they are drinking green tea. The active compound in green tea is a polyphenol called epigallocatechin gallate, EGCG. It is one of the most extensively studied anti-angiogenic compounds in existence, and when researchers tested it in the same laboratory assays used to evaluate pharmaceutical cancer drugs, EGCG demonstrated an ability to block abnormal blood vessel growth, comparable to some experimental oncology compounds. It works by interfering with VEGF signaling, the same distress signal that tumors send out to recruit blood vessels. EGCG essentially jams that signal. A study from the Chinese University of Hong Kong followed 68,000 women over 10 years and found that women who drank green tea regularly, defined as at least 3 cups per week, had a 27% lower risk of developing colorectal cancer compared to non-tea drinkers. Women who drank it daily had outcomes that were even more favorable. 3 cups daily of properly brewed loose leaf or bagged green tea from actual tea leaves, not bottled green tea products from a convenience store, which contain minimal active compounds and frequently contain added sugar. Brew your water at around 175 degrees Fahrenheit, which is steaming but not at a full boil. Steep for 3 to 5 minutes. Add lemon juice if you can tolerate it. Research shows that vitamin C stabilizes the catechins in your digestive system and increases EGCG absorption by approximately 6 times. Do not add dairy milk. The proteins in cow's milk bind directly to the beneficial polyphenols and block their absorption entirely. If you need to lighten your tea, a plant-based option will not interfere. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you are over 60, if you have a family history of cancer, or if you have been through a cancer diagnosis yourself, and you are watching this trying to figure out what you can actually do, I want you to write your age and where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. Not because I am collecting data, but because every time I read those comments, I am reminded of exactly who I am making these videos for. Real people with real stakes who deserve real information. So take a moment, write it down, and then stay with me, because the next 4 foods on this list include the one with the most dramatic anti-cancer evidence I have ever reviewed, and you do not want to miss it. The third food works through a completely different pathway, direct immune activation. And the research here is precise enough that I want to walk you through the numbers carefully. Your immune system has specialized cells called natural killer cells and T cells. These are the frontline forces that identify abnormal cells and eliminate them. Their count and activity level directly determine how effectively your body's cancer surveillance system operates. Researchers at the University of Auckland studied athletes, an interesting population because intense exercise temporarily suppresses immune function, which makes it easier to measure the effect of a dietary intervention against a clear baseline. They had athletes consume 1.5 cups of blueberries daily for 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, the athletes had 88% more T cells circulating in their bloodstream. 88%. Their natural killer cell activity was also significantly elevated. This was not a subjective measure of feeling healthier. This was a quantified increase in the actual immune cells responsible for destroying abnormal tissue. The active compounds are anthocyanins, the pigments that give blueberries their deep blue color. They are powerful immune modulators, meaning they do not simply stimulate immune activity indiscriminately. They reduce the chronic low-grade inflammation that creates a permissive environment for cancer growth, while simultaneously enhancing the targeted immune response against abnormal cells. That combination, anti-inflammatory and pro-immune at the same time, is one of the most valuable properties a food compound can have for cancer defense in an aging body. A separate analysis tracking nearly 200,000 people over more than 20 years found that those with the highest intake of anthocyanin-rich foods, primarily berries, had a 17% lower overall cancer risk. For specific cancers including esophageal and colorectal cancer, the risk reduction reached 40%. 1 cup of blueberries daily. Fresh or frozen. Frozen are sometimes higher in anthocyanins because they are picked and flash frozen at peak ripeness, rather than sitting in transit for days. The 4th food on this list is one that has been surrounded by more misinformation, more fear, and more confusion than almost anything else in nutritional medicine. And I want to address that confusion directly, because the myth around this food has genuinely harmed people by keeping them away from one of the most powerful anti-angiogenic compounds ever tested in a laboratory setting. We are talking about soy. tofu, tempeh, edamame, soy milk. The persistent myth is that soy is dangerous for cancer patients, particularly women with a history of breast cancer, because it contains compounds called phytoestrogens that supposedly mimic human estrogen and feed hormone-sensitive tumors. I understand why that fear exists. The name sounds alarming. But the science tells a completely different story, and I want to be precise about why. Phytoestrogens do not behave like human estrogen at the molecular level. They do not activate estrogen receptors the way endogenous estrogen does. In fact, they compete with human estrogen for those receptors and block them, which is the opposite of what the myth suggests. The net effect is protective against hormone-related cancers, not harmful. The active compound in soy is called genistein, and researchers at the University of Illinois measured its ability to inhibit VEGF signaling, the blood vessel recruitment process we discussed earlier. They found that genistein inhibited VEGF activity by over 70% in experimental models. 70% suppression of the primary mechanism tumors use to establish a blood supply. That is a number that belongs in a pharmaceutical study, and it came from a food that costs $2 at any grocery store. The population data supports this with remarkable consistency. Countries where soy consumption is a regular part of daily life show significantly lower rates of breast and prostate cancer compared to Western populations where soy is rarely consumed. A meta-analysis combining data from 35 separate studies found that women with the highest soy intake had a 29% lower risk of developing breast cancer. And for women who had already been diagnosed with breast cancer, higher soy intake was associated with better long-term outcomes and meaningfully lower recurrence rates. I had a patient, I will call him Raymond. He was 71 years old, a retired civil engineer from Georgia, meticulous and methodical in everything he did. Raymond came to me after a prostate cancer diagnosis, early stage, being managed with active surveillance. His oncologist had told him to watch and wait. Raymond wanted to know what else he could do. When I mentioned soy, he pushed back immediately. He said he had read online that soy was dangerous for cancer patients. I pulled up the meta-analysis right there in the exam room and walked him through the data. Raymond started eating edamame 3 times a week and incorporating tofu into 2 meals. At his 6-month follow-up, his PSA trajectory, the marker his oncologist was watching, had stabilized. Raymond called it the most productive conversation he had ever had in a doctor's office. I tell his story not to make a clinical claim about soy curing cancer because that is not what the research says. I tell it because fear built on misinformation keeps people away from foods that the evidence consistently supports. 2 servings of soy per week is the minimum target. Ideally, 1 serving every other day. Whole soy foods, edamame, tofu, tempeh, rather than heavily processed soy protein isolates. The 5th food requires a specific detail that most people get wrong, and getting it wrong means you are leaving the majority of the benefit on the table. We are talking about broccoli, but more specifically, broccoli sprouts. The active compound is sulforaphane, and it works through a pathway distinct from everything else we have discussed today. Sulforaphane activates a protein in your cells called NRF2. Think of it as a master switch for your body's internal detoxification and antioxidant systems. When NRF2 is activated, it triggers the production of enzymes that neutralize carcinogens before they can damage DNA, enhances the immune system's ability to identify and destroy abnormal cells, and directly interferes with the survival signals that cancer cells use to resist destruction. Here is the detail that matters. Mature broccoli contains sulforaphane, but broccoli sprouts, the 3 to 4 day old seedlings, contain approximately 100 times more sulforaphane per gram than the fully grown vegetable. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University confirmed this directly, finding that a small handful of broccoli sprouts delivers as much sulforaphane as several pounds of mature broccoli. You can find broccoli sprouts in the produce section of most well-stocked grocery stores, usually near other sprouts and microgreens. Or you can grow them yourself at home in a mason jar in about 4 days. They require nothing more than water, a lid with drainage holes, and a dark shelf. A 1/4 cup of broccoli sprouts 3 to 4 times per week is the research-supported target. If you genuinely cannot find sprouts, mature broccoli remains valuable, but focus on the stems rather than discarding them. The stems contain roughly twice the sulforaphane concentration of the florets. Chop them finely, add them to soups, stir-fries, or steam them alongside the rest of the vegetable. One preparation detail that most people do not know: Lightly steaming broccoli for 3 to 4 minutes actually increases sulforaphane bioavailability compared to eating it raw, because heat activates the enzyme myrosinase that converts the precursor compound into active sulforaphane. But boiling destroys it entirely. Steam, never boil. The sixth food, the one I told you at the beginning I was saving for last, works through both of the primary mechanisms we have discussed today simultaneously. It supports anti-angiogenesis and DNA protection at the same time, and the epidemiological data behind it is some of the most robust in all of nutritional oncology. But almost nobody eats it in the form that actually delivers the benefit. We are talking about tomatoes. Specifically, cooked tomatoes. The active compound is lycopene, a carotenoid that gives tomatoes their red color, and one of the most potent anti-angiogenic compounds found in any food. Here is the detail that changes everything about how you should be consuming this food. When you eat a raw tomato, your body absorbs a relatively small fraction of the lycopene it contains, because the cell walls of the tomato physically trap the compound. When you cook a tomato, in any form, tomato sauce, tomato paste, roasted tomatoes, crushed tomatoes simmered in olive oil, the heat breaks down those cell walls and releases lycopene in a form your digestive system can absorb dramatically more efficiently. Cooking does not diminish this nutrient, it multiplies your access to it. A landmark study from Harvard Medical School followed over 47,000 men for 12 years and tracked their consumption of tomato products alongside prostate cancer incidence. Men who consumed cooked tomato products at least twice per week had a 23% lower risk of developing prostate cancer compared to men who rarely ate tomatoes. Men who consumed 10 or more servings of cooked tomato products per week had a risk reduction approaching 35%. These are not small effects. These are clinically meaningful numbers drawn from one of the largest and longest-running nutritional studies ever conducted. Lycopene also works synergistically with fat, meaning it absorbs significantly better when consumed alongside a healthy fat source. Tomato sauce cooked with a tablespoon of olive oil. Roasted tomatoes drizzled with olive oil before going into the oven. Crushed tomatoes added to a dish where you have already sautéed garlic and olive oil. These are not just culinary traditions. They are, it turns out, physiologically sound preparation methods that the Italian and Mediterranean populations arrived at centuries before the research confirmed why they worked. 3 servings of cooked tomato products per week is the minimum. More is better, and given how easily tomato paste and sauce can be incorporated into everyday cooking, this is one of the least burdensome recommendations on this entire list. Now, I want to bring all of this together in a way that is practical and actionable, because information without implementation does not protect anyone. I want to give you a framework for how to incorporate all 6 of these foods into a realistic weekly routine without overhauling your entire diet or spending significant money. These foods are not expensive. They are not exotic. They are available in every major grocery store in the United States, and most of them can be incorporated into meals you are probably already making. In the morning, 1 to 2 kiwis alongside your breakfast, or blend it into a smoothie if you prefer. That covers your DNA repair support for the day. Brew your first cup of green tea and drink it before noon. If you are having 3 cups, space them through the morning and early afternoon. At lunch or dinner, incorporate cooked tomatoes at least 3 times across your week. A simple tomato sauce over pasta, a bowl of tomato soup made from crushed canned tomatoes and olive oil, roasted cherry tomatoes as a side dish. These are 15-minute preparations. 2 to 3 times per week. Edamame as a snack, tofu incorporated into a stir-fry or soup, or tempeh sliced and pan-cooked alongside vegetables. This does not require learning new recipes. It requires substituting one protein source you already use for a soy-based alternative on 2 evenings. 3 to 4 times per week. A quarter cup of broccoli sprouts added to a sandwich, folded into a salad, or simply eaten alongside whatever you are already having for lunch. If you are growing them at home, you will have a continuous fresh supply that costs almost nothing. And 1 cup of blueberries every day, in yogurt, in oatmeal, in a smoothie, or simply eaten by the handful. This is the easiest recommendation on the list to sustain, because the barrier is essentially 0. I want to close with something I say to patients in my office, and I mean it with complete sincerity. You are not helpless in front of this disease. The narrative that cancer is something that either happens to you or it does not, that your DNA is your fate and your diet is irrelevant. That narrative is not supported by the evidence. The research I have walked you through today comes from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, the University of Oslo, the University of Auckland, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and dozens of other institutions that have spent decades documenting the precise mechanisms through which food interacts with your body's cancer defense systems. This is not wellness culture. This is molecular biology applied to the kitchen. After 60, your body is not failing. It is asking for more specific support than it needed at 40. The immune surveillance system that once operated with effortless precision now needs the right nutritional environment to stay sharp. The DNA repair mechanisms that once ran automatically now need the compounds found in kiwis and blueberries and green tea to keep pace with the daily damage load. The angiogenesis regulation that once held microscopic tumors frozen and harmless now benefits from the genistein in soy and the lycopene in cooked tomatoes and the sulforaphane in broccoli sprouts to stay in balance. Your health is worth fighting for. And now you have 6 more weapons to fight with.